In 1994, a director with 2 features to his name took a handful of pulp crime paperbacks, threw the pages in the air, and let them land out of order. The result made a boxer, a briefcase, and a pair of philosophical hitmen into permanent fixtures of pop culture. Everybody remembers the dialogue. Fewer people know what was actually happening behind the camera to make it. Here are the facts about Pulp Fiction that even devoted fans tend to miss, including a bonus entry before we even hit number 15. And stick around for the story of how Samuel L. Jackson had to fight to keep a role that was already supposed to be his. The Los Angeles coffee shop, where Pumpkin and Honey Bunny talked themselves into robbing the room they're sitting in, wasn't built on a soundstage. It was a real, shuttered restaurant called the Hawthorne Grill, sitting at the corner of Hawthorne Boulevard and 137th Place, a spot that had originally opened in 1956 under the name Holly's, before eventually being rebranded, and, by the time location scouts found it, closed and abandoned for years. The production designer has described walking in to discover the previous owners had simply locked the doors and left everything behind. Napkins still sitting on the tables, place settings still out, as though the staff had vanished mid-shift. That untouched, frozen-in-time quality is a large part of why the location felt so right for a scene about small-time hopefuls talking themselves into one last score. The building's afterlife is its own strange coda. Buoyed by the film's popularity, a new owner briefly reopened the diner in 1995, complete with a mural and cardboard cutouts of the cast, only for the restaurant to file for bankruptcy within a year. The building itself was torn down in 1999 and replaced with an AutoZone auto parts store. The site of one of the most quoted diner scenes in movie history is now a parking lot for car batteries. Watch Pulp Fiction closely, and you'll notice something missing. There's no composer credit. No swelling orchestral score cueing you on how to feel. Every piece of music in the film is a pre-existing recording, dropped in like a mixtape rather than written for the picture. Tarantino has explained the logic in blunt terms, saying he leaned on surf music because it functioned like site index equals 29-1, a rock and roll version of the kind of moody Ennio Morricone spaghetti western scoring he wanted / site. Dick Dale's blistering instrumental Missalou, which blasts over the opening titles, wasn't written for the movie either. It began life decades earlier as an Eastern Mediterranean folk melody before Dale, drawing on music he'd heard his Lebanese relatives play on the oud, sped it up into a surf rock anthem in the early 1960s, reportedly on a dare from a fan who bet he couldn't play an entire song on just one guitar string. Beyond the opening titles, the soundtrack keeps leaning on the same well. The Centurion's Bullwinkle Part 2 scores the overdose sequence. The Tornadoes, Bustin' Surfboards plays under a scene about body piercing. And the lively one, Surf Rider, closes the film out exactly the way it opened, bringing the whole thing full circle on a wave of reverb-heavy guitar. Tarantino didn't commission a single new note for his second feature. He built the entire emotional architecture of the film out of other people's records, and it worked so well that the soundtrack itself became a cultural event, kicking off a mini revival of vintage surf guitar that even started showing up in fast food commercials within a couple of years of the film's release. Jules Winfield's wallet, the one embroidered with a phrase far too blunt to put on a business card, wasn't a prop built by the art department. It belonged to Quentin Tarantino personally, and he simply handed it over for Samuel L. Jackson to use on camera. The inscription itself is a direct homage to the 1971 blaxploitation landmark Shaft, and specifically to its famous theme song. The detail that makes this genuinely strange is what happened almost a decade later. Jackson, the actor who carried that wallet through the diner robbery scene, went on to headline the 2000 Shaft remake as the title character's nephew. A personal keepsake in one movie quietly predicted a completely different casting decision 6 years down the road. Pulp Fiction's premiere at the 1994 Cannes Film Festival didn't unfold the way most people assume a beloved classic's origin story should. When jury president Clint Eastwood announced that Tarantino's film had won the festival's highest honor, the Palme d'Or, a section of the crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in jeers. Many in attendance had expected the award to go to Krzysztof Kieślowski's Three Colors, Red, the final installment of his trilogy, and, for some critics, a more fitting send-off for a revered filmmaker. One furious audience member reportedly shouted the Polish director's name from the balcony as Tarantino accepted his trophy. Tarantino's response was to laugh and flip her off before thanking the jury. Producer Lawrence Bender later admitted the team had gone into the ceremony expecting nothing bigger than a prize for ensemble acting, and it was only as the rest of the awards were handed out, without their names being called, that he and Tarantino realized the Palme d'Or itself was still on the table. Eastwood defended the choice afterward, calling it a democratic decision by a jury that simply found the film structure original. It's also worth putting that reaction in context. Pulp Fiction is far from the only future classic to get booed at Cannes. Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver was jeered on its way to winning the same prize back in 1976, and David Lynch's Wild at Heart took a similar hit in 1990 before also walking away with the Palme d'Or. Getting booed at the exact moment you win the festival's top honor turns out to be a strange little tradition all its own, and Tarantino's second feature is now permanently part of that particular club. 20 years after that mixed reception in France, the Library of Congress made its own, considerably calmer judgment. In 2013, Pulp Fiction was inducted into the National Film Registry, the government's official list of American films judged culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, and therefore worth permanently preserving for future generations. It went in alongside films as tonally different as Mary Poppins and The Right Stuff, in a class of just 25 titles selected that year out of the entire history of American cinema. The registry's own citation credited the film with reshaping independent filmmaking in the United States, calling it a mordantly wicked Mobius strip of a movie that changed how a generation of directors approached structure. A film that once had festival audiences booing it from the balcony now sits in the same national vault as Casablanca and the Apollo 11 footage. Pulp Fiction was made for roughly $8.5 million, a modest number even by independent film standards of the early 1990s, with additional marketing costs bringing the total closer to double that. What it earned back reframed what a mid-budget crime picture could do commercially. About $107.9 million domestically and nearly $213 million worldwide, making it the first Miramax release to cross the $100 million mark in North America. That box office arrived despite the film playing on noticeably fewer screens than nearly every other major release of 1994. Overseas, the film's cultural footprint went beyond ticket sales entirely. In the United Kingdom, the published screenplay itself became a top 10 bestseller, reportedly the most successful movie script ever published there. For a studio like Miramax, which had built its reputation on smaller specialty releases, crossing 9 figures domestically on a single film was a watershed moment, one that helped push the entire independent film sector further into the commercial mainstream over the back half of the 1990s. In terms of pure domestic ranking, Pulp Fiction landed as the 10th highest-grossing release of 1994 overall, a remarkable placement for a film that never had anywhere near the screen count of the studio blockbusters surrounding it on that list. Getting John Travolta cast as Vincent Vega required a genuine standoff, and Tarantino wasn't the one holding the winning hand. Miramax chief Harvey Weinstein reportedly wanted almost anyone else in the role. Names floated at various points included Daniel Day-Lewis, fresh off an Oscar win, along with other established stars. Tarantino, however, insisted on Travolta, whose film career had gone quiet by the early 90s. The deal only held because of how the project was structured on paper. The script had come to the screen through Danny DeVito's production company, Jersey Films, which had negotiated final cut and casting approval as part of its arrangement with the studio. DeVito has said he used that leverage to back Tarantino's choice, even as Weinstein pushed back. Travolta ultimately took the role for a comparatively small fee, and the film went on to earn him an Academy Award nomination, a comeback that reshaped the rest of his career. The broader deal Tarantino's team negotiated going into production was unusually favorable for a director with only one prior feature to his name. Alongside casting approval, the agreement reportedly locked in final cut and protected the film's unusually long runtime from studio interference, terms that gave Tarantino far more creative control than a filmmaker at his career stage would typically be handed. In 1993, before a single scene had been shot, Bruce Willis was the only genuine box office draw attached to the production, Travolta was viewed as a gamble, and Jackson, while respected, wasn't yet a marquee name. Willis agreed to appear for well below his usual asking price, simply because he liked the script. The financial upside of his involvement, though, came less from his performance and more from what his name allowed Miramax to do before the film ever screened. The studio pre-sold the international distribution rights largely on the strength of Willis's marquee value, and reportedly recouped roughly $11 million from foreign markets alone, money that helped cover the production before it even opened in the United States. That international pre-sale gave Tarantino a level of creative freedom that a more conventional financing arrangement likely wouldn't have allowed. The cherry red 1964 Chevrolet Chevelle Malibu convertible that Vincent Vega drives belonged to Tarantino himself. He bought it in 1989 with money earned from selling the script for True Romance. Sometime around the film's 1994 release, the car was stolen and simply disappeared. It resurfaced almost 2 decades later, in 2013, when a California sheriff's deputy stopped 2 men stripping parts from an old vehicle and discovered the identification numbers didn't match the plate on file. The car had been re-registered under a false identity. Tracing the original chassis stamp revealed it was Tarantino's long-missing Chevelle. The man who'd unknowingly bought and restored the stolen car over the years got the vehicle taken from him without compensation once its true ownership was established, while Tarantino got his convertible back for free. That same Chevelle didn't disappear from Tarantino's universe once filming wrapped, either. A battered Honda Civic used elsewhere in the film for Butch's escape reportedly turned up again in the background of Jackie Brown 3 years later. A small, easy-to-miss continuity thread connecting 2 otherwise unrelated stories, simply because the production reused a car it already owned. The twist contest at Jack Rabbit Slim's is one of the most imitated scenes in modern film, and its most obvious reference points, Saturday Night Fever, Grease, aren't actually where it came from. Tarantino has pointed instead to Jean-Luc Godard's 1964 film Band Apart, Band of Outsiders, which features an impromptu, deliberately unglamorous dance sequence in a cafe. Tarantino admired the scene enough that he named his own production company, A Band Apart, directly after it. The choreography that ended up on screen was loose by design. Uma Thurman drew some of her movements from an entirely different source, Disney's The Aristocats, while John Travolta improvised much of his side of the routine on the day of filming. It's a scene most audiences read as a pure homage to disco-era Travolta, when it's really a video store clerk's tribute to an obscure French art film smuggled into a mainstream American blockbuster. The adrenaline shot sequence, where Vincent revives Mia after her overdose, remains one of the most physically jarring moments in the film, and the effect was achieved almost entirely in the editing room rather than through prosthetics. On set, the crew positioned a prop syringe against Uma Thurman's chest and had Travolta pull it away quickly. The footage was then reversed, turning a withdrawal into what reads on screen as a violent plunge. A heavy sound effect on the mix does the rest of the work, letting the audience's imagination fill in the gore that was never actually filmed. It's worth noting, separately from the trivia, that the scene isn't a medically sound depiction of how to respond to an opioid overdose, and viewers shouldn't take it as instructional. For a production that was frugal almost everywhere else, the recreated 1950s themed diner, where Vincent takes Mia, was the one deliberate extravagance, reportedly costing around $150,000 to build from scratch, an enormous outlay relative to the film's overall $8.5 million budget. Production designer David Wasco filled the space with details built to reward repeat viewings, including booths fashioned to look like vintage cars sliced in half. The waitstaff dressed as 1950s icons. The Buddy Holly character behind the counter is played by Steve Buscemi, who 2 years earlier had delivered Reservoir Dogs' monologue about why he refuses to tip waitresses, a small in-joke buried under an apron. The set exists in the finished film for roughly 10 minutes of screen time, which makes it one of the more expensive per-minute locations in 1990s independent cinema. It's also worth noting that Jack Rabbit Slim's was never a real restaurant chain the production simply rented. The whole concept, right down to the vintage car booths and the twist contest dance floor, was designed and constructed specifically for this film, drawing inspiration from real retro diner concepts like Los Angeles' Ed DeBevick's and the space-age Googie, architecture popularized by designer John Lautner. Everything about the location that makes it feel like a place with decades of history behind it was, in fact, built from nothing in a matter of weeks. Jules Winfield was written with Jackson in mind, but the part briefly slipped out of his hands during pre-production. A stage actor named Paul Calderon gave a strong enough audition that producers began seriously discussing recasting the role. Jackson, hearing that his own part was suddenly in play, flew back to Los Angeles to audition again for a role he'd already been told was his. He reportedly walked into that second reading tired, frustrated, and still carrying fast food he'd picked up on the way, and delivered the diner monologue with enough controlled intensity that the producers dropped the idea of recasting entirely. Calderon didn't leave the production, though. Tarantino kept him on in a smaller role, as the bartender at Marcellus Wallace's club, a small consolation prize for an audition good enough to nearly cost Jackson his own part. Before Jackson was cast at all, Tarantino had originally conceived Jules for Lawrence Fishburne, drawn to the rhythm and gravity Fishburne could bring to the character's philosophical menace. Fishburne turned the role down. By some accounts, he was uncomfortable with how the script's approach to heroin was going to read on screen. That declination opened the door for Jackson, whose performance ultimately earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, a nomination Fishburne, ironically, might otherwise have been in line for himself. It's a reminder that some of the most quoted, most imitated performances in film history exist only because someone else said no first. Pulp Fiction's screenplay splits into distinct, interlocking sections that, if reassembled into the order events actually happen, would run in a completely different sequence than the one audiences see on screen. The effect is that Vincent Vega, killed roughly two-thirds of the way through the theatrical cut, is very much alive again for the film's climactic diner robbery, because that robbery, chronologically, happens earlier in the story than his death. Structurally, the film has been compared by critics to a Mobius strip, a single continuous loop where the ending folds back to touch the beginning. That structural choice was one of only 2 competition prizes the film picked up at that controversial 1994 Cannes ceremony worth mentioning in its own right. Tarantino and co-writer Roger Avary shared the Best Original Screenplay Oscar for it the following spring, the film's lone Academy Award win despite 7 total nominations, including Best Picture. Vincent Vega and Vic Vega, the latter being Michael Madsen's Mr. Blonde from Reservoir Dogs, were written as brothers, a connection Tarantino planted deliberately rather than as a coincidence between his first 2 films. For years afterward, he floated a prequel, sometimes called The Vega Brothers, that would have shown Vincent running a nightclub in Amsterdam for Marcellus Wallace, before Vic's release from prison brought the 2 together for one last reckless stretch of time, prior to the separate fates that eventually catch up with each of them in their respective films. Tarantino discussed the project in interviews for well over a decade, always describing it as something he still intended to make. The idea never got produced, for a reason that has nothing to do with rights, money, or interest. Both Travolta and Madsen simply aged out of the parts, and the visual effects technology needed to convincingly de-age 2 actors by that many years didn't exist when the project was being seriously discussed. 2 characters who die in 2 different movies were nearly reunited alive in a third, until time did what neither script nor studio could undo. What makes the whole idea more interesting in hindsight is how casually it started. The premise grew out of a single throwaway line in Pulp Fiction itself, when Vincent mentions in passing that he spent time in Amsterdam. That's it. One offhand detail in an existing script became the seed for an entire planned feature that Tarantino kept talking about for the better part of 2 decades without it ever reaching a soundstage. This is the story that ties nearly everything else on this list together. After Fishburne passed on Jules and Jackson had already been told the role was his, and after Paul Calderon's audition briefly put that promise in jeopardy, Jackson flew overnight to Los Angeles to defend a part he had every reason to believe was already settled. He arrived exhausted, and in a detail that sounds almost too neat to be real, was greeted at the casting office by someone who mistakenly addressed him as Mr. Fishburne, confusing him with the very actor whose rejection had opened the door for him in the first place. Jackson said nothing. He sat down, ate the fast food he'd brought with him in total silence, and let the room absorb the discomfort of watching him do it. Then he stood up and delivered the diner monologue with enough force that, by multiple accounts from people in the room that day, it visibly unsettled everyone watching. He didn't just win the role back. He won it back, while everyone in the room was still trying to figure out who he even was. 16 facts, one movie, and roughly none of it as simple as it looks from the outside. A stolen convertible, a reversed camera trick standing in for stage blood, a French art film hiding inside a diner